I'm Paul Levinson, and welcome to Light On, Light Through, episode 307. The notorious Captain Phil and I have a lengthy conversation about what can be done to finally reduce these horrendous shootings that have been going on in the United States. We talked for about an hour and a half about that. We started our conversation, however, with about 15 minutes of much lighter conversation about the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, science fiction, and Star Trek. So that conversation is very different from what follows. By the way, I did make one slight mistake when I was talking about the Beatles. I said that the Beatles' Revolver came out slightly before the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, and I got that reversed. Actually, Pet Sounds came out, I think, in May 1966, and Revolver came out in the summer of that year, in August of 1966. In any case, here now is our conversation.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
So, my friend, here we are. It is Memorial Day, and you know what? We're going to talk about some heavy stuff, and we might sacrifice a few sacred cows here and there. We might blow your mind. We might give you a breath of fresh air. Who knows? But I do want you to know that the opinions expressed in this next 2 hours are the opinions of the people who gave them. That would be Paul Levinson, man of mystery, and Captain Phil, man of no mystery. Okay? If you have an issue with what we're saying, the complaints come to us, not station management, all right, and or WUSB as a whole. It's just me and him, mostly me. He's on vacation. Give the dude a break. Paul, let's get your credits in before we kick into high gear, because we're gonna get deep. So yeah, let's get all the books, the music, the teaching, everything, man. Let's hear it.
Well, first of all, I'm really never on vacation, and right now
you're like Batman.
That's right. I'm always
always
there. That's right. I'm always watching for that signal
Yes.
in the sky. Anyway, well, just to underline that point, here I am on Cape Cod, and it's absolutely gorgeous up here. But I am turning my short story, It's Real Life, which, by the way, is available for free on a site called Vocal, Vocal. And the story is written, it's not spoken, although there's actually, there are 2 videos there of me reading parts of that story. Anyway, it's an alternate history story about the Beatles, and I'm turning it into a novel, and I'm having a great time doing it. And since I've been up here on Cape Cod, I've already written what's going to be the second, and now I'm into the 3rd chapter. So that's one of the main things I'm working on.
And isn't this like an alternate history where Lennon was never assassinated?
Yes, that's right.
And the Beatles never broke up?
That's exactly right.
And wait, did they go disco in the late 70s? That's what or is that going to be in the book? Or is that going to be
I know. I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. I mean, what kind of terrible idea is that? But
Stones kind of went disco, the Stones, remember I'll come into your emotional rescue. That was a disco song. So
yeah, that's true. By the way, did you hear about, apropos of the Stones, I loved, there's like a little now, it's heating up, a little sarcasm now being exchanged between McCartney and Mick Jagger. I'm trying to remember who started it. I think it was Jagger, for some reason, unaccountably, basically just called the Beatles like a very light pop band.
Oh, give me a break.
And then McCartney, when he had a chance, basically said, well, the Stones, all they do is cover rhythm and blues songs. But they're both great groups. Anyway, so that's...
the battle is on. World War III has begun.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Those are fighting words. That's crazy. I just want to mention our buddy Scotty O does the Beatles show on Thursday afternoons opposite Captain Phil's Planet. and he was on last week, and he did the anniversary of the Sgt. Pepper's Band album.
Oh, that's a worthy anniversary. I'll, as long as you mention that, I learned an extremely important lesson about Sgt. Pepper. In fact, I wrote a little essay that appeared in one of my early books, Electronic Chronicles, and the essay was called Sgt. Pepper and the Presumption of Genius. And I'm not sure if I ever told you this, but the first time I heard Sgt. Pepper, I ran out and bought the album back in June 1967, I didn't like it at all. I had been loving Rubber Soul and loving Revolver, when I heard Sgt. Pepper, I said, what is this? They'd really gone, off the deep end. There were a couple of songs that I liked, but by and large, I didn't like it at all. I listened to it 3-4 times. I still didn't like it. And finally, I said to myself, look, there's something wrong here. Either, there's something wrong with your taste, or there's something wrong with the Beatles. And I realized, well, of the two, chances are there's something wrong with me. So I kept listening, and then I began loving A Little Help from My Friends, and I began loving Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, to this very day, I still prefer Rubber Soul and Revolver to Sgt. Pepper, but I do think Sgt. Pepper is a great album. So,
well, you bring up an interesting idea, too, because, you progressed chronologically through the Beatles as they, grew as artists, whereas a lot of people, myself included, got into the Beatles when their entire opus had been launched into the world. So we weren't seeing it as they moved into that direction. So I think some people started with Sgt. Pepper and worked their way backwards, or here and there, or they heard it, or whatever was being played on the radio. And I think after Sgt. Pepper came out, I think what's the really long song at the end? Is it A Day in the Life?
A Day in the Life, yeah.
Yeah. That's. Yeah. I remember hearing that on FM radio in my sister's car when I was 7 or 8 years old, and that was just you know what I'm saying? And that's and just to have that experience, it sort of changes the way you receive that information. I think it changes your brain. But if you're progressing, a lot of times I go through bands I love, and their second or third album I'm completely in love with, and now I'm following them, so I'm going to buy whatever comes out next, and they release an album, and I'm like, why don't I like this? Yeah. So I kind of see what you're saying there. It took a while, but go ahead.
It's a tough decision, because if you have a hit record and you're successful, there's an understandable almost compulsion to continue doing that.
Yeah.
Because why mess with a successful formula? And the Beatles deliberately put that aside, and some people might say they went too far in the other direction. You're just trying to come up with something new every single time. But if you think about a group like the Supremes, and you think about Motown in general, they eventually evolved. And in the end, the Supremes did sound, a lot different than Baby, Baby,
yeah.
Yeah. And, they did, and the Temptations also, they started out, being just pretty much straight, R&B pop, and, developed into something else, but it took them a long time. So they're an example, Motown, of the other approach, where you find a successful formula, you stick with it for 4, 5, 6 years, and then you begin to branch out into something else.
Hey, not to get too far afield, but just refresh my memory. Did the Beach Boys' Animal Sounds come out before or after Sgt. Pepper? Do you know? I don't know off the top of my head. I'm a bad DJ.
You're talking about Pet Sounds.
Pet Sounds, yeah.
Right. Yeah, yes. Pet Sounds came out. Pet Sounds was, I think, the Beach Boys' response to Revolver. And they because the two groups were in competition. And Paul McCartney now always says that Sgt. Pepper was born in an attempt to outdo the Beach Boys in Pet Sounds.
Wow.
So the Beach Boys, they heard Rubber Soul and Revolver, and they realized that it was really not, in the same universe as what they had been doing. And so they did Pet Sounds. And by the way, I would just say on Pet Sounds, the arrangement of Sloop John B., which is not a song, of course, that they wrote. That's an old folk song. We sail on the Sloop John B. But Brian Wilson arranged that and is, to this day, in my opinion, right up there with the best harmonic arrangements of all time. So, yeah, they were a great group, and they had their own problems. Brian Wilson went a little crazy.
That's what I love about talking to you, man. We just go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Oh, this is a lot more fun to talk about than what we're going to do.
Well, yeah. So you got the book coming out, and with the Beatles alternate history story, and then of course you have your podcast and reviews and everything. So just point people at that.
Yeah. Well, my podcast is Light On, Light Through, spelled just the way it sounds. Through is THROUGH, and on that podcast, I have a combination of reviewing every science fiction television series or movie that I can see on television that I can watch. And so, for example, I'm currently reviewing The Man Who Fell to Earth and The Time Traveler's Wife, both superb series. I'll have reviews of that up soon. And apropos of what you and I had a great conversation with a couple of weeks ago, I'm now watching and reviewing Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And I have to take a moment here to say, when you and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, I hadn't yet seen it. Now that I've seen the first 4 episodes, I think it's by far the best Star Trek series since the original series, which I always held to be the best series. Now, obviously, The Next Generation is a close competitor, and it has some fabulous episodes. But I have to say, Strange New Worlds is just fabulous.
Well, and they're not afraid to go into issues, and I haven't seen the 4th episode yet. I just finished the last episode with the gaseous beings, and number 1 with the whole, right, changing her DNA and stuff like that.
The Illyrians,
yeah. And I like that they're facing these issues head on the way the original Star Trek did, but the whole thing is brought up to the 21st century. For us 21st century, cynical eyes, the generation who grew up on Watchmen, the generation that on these dystopian, like the Battlestar Galactica reboot, those things, and it's turned the page a little bit and giving people hope. It's when when they stopped on the first episode, they stopped them from basically going to war.
Right,
it's just great, just a great anti-war episode, and prejudice and all these different things. And it's filling out or fleshing out those characters that we saw just briefly in the cage.
That's right. I have to say, I also love young Spock. I think he's great. Several, the J.J. Abrams movies had a young Spock also. But this guy, Ethan Peck, who, by the way, is Gregory Peck's grandson, he is doing a great job. And by the way, about that Illyrian episode, I love the fact that number 1 says something along the lines of, we don't terraform planets, we transform ourselves. Yeah. And if you think about it, that's a very enlightened attitude. And one of the things I point out in my book, that harkens back to a great science fiction story I read as a kid by A.E. Van Vogt, V-O-G-T. I think it was called The Enchanted Village, published in the early 1950s.
I read that story. He crash lands on Mars, and he's trying to survive.
Right.
And of course, Mars, I believe Mars in the story has a breathable atmosphere. Am I right?
Barely, yes.
Yeah, so he's trying to survive. And this automated village is trying to provide for him, and it's not working, and he tries to eat the food, and it's making him sick, and he's just trying, and he knows this abandoned Martian village that he's all alone. He knows it's trying to help him. And then at the end of the story, spoiler alert, at the end of the story, he eats the food and everything is great. And then it describes as he walks away, I think he has like a tail or something, and
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's feeling great. He's happy as a clam, and that's because he probably looks like a clam.
A Martian clam.
A Martian clam, right? Yeah.
Oh,
So
that's such a blast from the past. I remember reading that when I was like a teenager. I love that story.
Yeah.
A.E. Van Vogt. What's the name of it again that I can't remember?
The Enchanted Village.
The Enchanted Village. And of course, those of you, and we're not going to talk about Star Trek all night, so relax. Those of you who are listening here to Paul Levinson on A.E. Van Vogt's novel, The Space Beagle, in some respects was the template for Star Trek and definitely for the movie Alien.
That's right.
Black Destroyer was a story that basically Alien lifted from classic science fiction. When did he write that? The 40s or the 50s, Paul?
I think the 40s. Most of his stuff was in the 40s. Maybe some was in the early 50s too. But he actually was a little ahead of certainly Heinlein. Asimov was writing, his foundation stories in the 40s too. But, the golden age of science fiction is generally said to be the 1950s because you have the big three, Asimov, Heinlein, and A.C. Clarke. But Van Vogt was a little bit before them, and he often doesn't get enough credit. I think he was Canadian, if I'm not mistaken.
I think you're right. And I mean, people who have, critically dissected his work, there are issues. If you go into it, there is some clunkiness, but in terms of the ideas, I mean, the story that Paul just described, with the Enchanted Village, it was such a mind-blowing idea, and you have to put it in perspective, like what we were talking about with Sgt. Pepper. Like Paul is encountering that after following the Beatles' career, as he goes through as the music is being released. Of course, you out there have seen Alien, you've seen Star Trek, you've seen these things, and if you encounter A.E. Van Vogt's The Voyage of the Space Beagle, and it's a patch-up novel of different novelettes, and you read Black Destroyer, you'll say, this is just like Alien. He stole it from Alien. It's like, no, no. But yeah, I did read your review of Time Traveler's Wife. I think you wrote a short review of the first episode. That's something, I haven't read the book, I haven't seen the movie, but I love the premise. And I love how they maintain this loving relationship. So that's something I want to watch as well, Time Traveler's Wife. And of course, maybe at some point in July or August, I'll have you back, Paul, when we have a few more episodes in to Star Trek Strange New Worlds with Michael Rizzo and Mary Jo Rakowski, and we'll really nerd it up. And that'll be on a Friday night. We'll really nerd it up and have a good time with that.
Good. Love it.
So there's a lot of stuff going on. I was listening as I drove back from this flea market I was selling at today. As I'm driving back, I was listening to this rerun of they put on public radio up here in Albany, the local news reporters, the newspaper reporters, the news writers. And they discuss everything, and they're saying everything is flying at us so quickly. It's climate change, but it's Ukraine. Then there's the Buffalo shooting. Then now there's the Texas shooting, and there's the price of gas. And then there's inflation, quote unquote inflation, or is it price gouging? All these different things, and it's just hard to absorb it all. But right now, Paul, I really feel like the shooting in Texas has taken center stage, and I'm going to turn you loose on this, Paul. Let's give us your thoughts on that terrible tragedy of what just happened in Texas.
Well, it's about as horrible a tragedy as can happen, right? Where little kids are gunned down, and this, by the way, is one of the things that makes what's going on in Ukraine. The Russian invasion. It's not just a war. The Russians are killing little kids also because they're just shelling indiscriminately wherever they can. But to be honest with you and everyone, I have never been a friend of the police. And you and I have talked about this, I'm sure many times over the years. I remember as a little, well, maybe not a little kid, I was a young teenager. It was around the July 4th weekend. Back in the late 1950s, I'm standing in front of a Carvel with some friends of mine.
Yep.
A police car pulls up. They shove me against the wall. They're looking for firecrackers. And I remember thinking, in the years that followed. It's a good thing I wasn't black, otherwise I wouldn't be here talking about it.
Yeah.
But what happened in Texas has put all of this in a new light, because it's not just that cops, as we know, are racist. It's not just that they're trigger happy. It's that they're cowards. And there's no other word to describe it. And, when you hear, as this comes out, it just gets more and more horrifying and sickening that here are these cops. I don't blame them for being afraid for their lives. And we'll get into this in a few minutes, where the killer is there with a semi-automatic weapon that's far more powerful than the weapons the cops have. I don't blame them for being frightened, but I would be frightened too. But that's their job. And I heard somebody, I can't remember his name, he was some kind of police advisor in the Obama administration. I saw him at MSNBC a couple of nights ago, and he put it very well. He said, the job of law enforcement, when you have an active shooter, is if there are innocent people whose lives are at stake, you have to engage that active shooter. You have to risk your life. You have to draw that active shooter's attention away from the innocent victims who have no weapons at all. You at least have some weapons. And that, apparently, I'm no expert on what police procedure is, but according to this Obama advisor, that's what standard police procedure is and has been since Columbine. You don't wait. You go in and you engage the shooter. And that gives the innocent people there, in this case, kids, for God's sakes, a chance to escape, because the active shooter has to turn and look at whoever it is who's shooting at him. And obviously it's very, very dangerous. And, I'm sure that there are some heroes in the police. But now it seems in Texas, not only do police kill innocent African Americans whose crime is nothing other in their eyes than being black, but now they can't even do their goddamn job when there's a killer shooting innocent kids in a classroom. And what? They're waiting. What are they waiting for?
Yeah, and as this is being revealed bit by bit, again, I'm about 24 hours behind in the news cycle right now, so I'm not sure what the latest stuff is, but basically up to where you said, like, there was a group of police outside the door. This was a double classroom, so this was a classroom with two rooms attached, like a hotel room, where you could go back and forth in between, I'm assuming. And he's shooting through the walls and through the doors. The adults were killed first. He didn't just go in there and indiscriminately just go, and I think he was just, it seems to me like, and this is going to sound mortifying, it sounds to me like he was doing an execution style. He was picking them off one at a time. If it was taking him 45 minutes. So that's really disturbing. And I can't imagine, and I'm a teacher, I'm a retired teacher who actually in the last few years of my career did do active shooter drills with my students. So the teachers out there, who are currently teaching, this is something you do with these active shooter drills, and this is happening all over the country, even in New York, right in Port Jeff where I was teaching, where the school goes into lockdown, you cover the windows, you lock the door, you make sure no one can see in, and you hide under a desk until the principal says it's over. And people will walk around the school and try to open the doors, and you have to be quiet, And couple this, Paul, with the fact that I was teaching special education, okay? The kids that aren't going to be quiet, and I can't imagine, I wasn't working with the physically handicapped at that point. I can't imagine a classroom with a bunch of kids in wheelchairs, and breathing tubes, which is a group I had taught, years before, having to do, how do you prepare for that? How do they prepare for that? It seems ridiculous, but the way we bend over backwards for the right to purchase these weapons, it seems incomprehensible, absolutely incomprehensible.
Yeah.
And it confuses me, like you said, that they didn't rush in, that they didn't go in, and I really don't understand. I completely understand them being afraid, because I read this stuff and I'm terrified, and I would, trust me, I mean, I could not, I could not imagine it. But at the same time, there had to be a better method, besides sit there and wait, or just wait. So
Yeah, and the full
so
story.
confusing. Go ahead.
It's very confusing. Well, the full story, at least as far as we know it at this time, we've all heard this more than once by now and read about it, is that the state troopers who arrived there, they wanted to go in. They knew what the right thing to do was, but apparently the local authorities, I don't know whether it's in Texas or all over the United States, but at least in that situation in Texas, the local authorities had the command authority. And they told the troopers, no, don't go in yet. They mistakenly thought that the shooter was no longer actively killing people, that it was barricaded. And the only reason why there wasn't even a greater loss of life is that eventually, after an hour and 20 minutes, or however long the state troopers were there, eventually the state troopers just decided, hey, we're going in. And they defied the idiotic orders of those local Texas police. And, I have to say, getting back to that, and, this is not a time to be glib, but I couldn't help but thinking, the NRA and its, the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Not this time.
No, you need a guy with a gun who has a brain in his or her head. You need a guy with a gun who has a little courage. You need a guy with a gun who understands what's going on and that there are innocent lives at stake. You need a guy with a gun who knows how to do his or her job. So that, maybe we'd have to live to be 1,000 years old. And I'm sure the NRA won't admit that it got it completely wrong. But that's one of the things that this tragedy in Texas, Uvalde, shows. By the way, let's, though, indeed talk a little bit about, you mentioned, why was this 18-year-old kid able to buy a gun like this? And here I have to tell you, ever since I was a little kid and I began to understand this, I got, and as you know, I'm a great champion of the First Amendment. I know why it's so important to a democracy that people be able to speak their minds, even if we find what they say hateful. Because as soon as you begin to crack down on communications, you are paving the road to a fascistic society. So I think the First Amendment was a stroke of genius on the part of our founding fathers, and it's one of the things that has kept America relatively free. It's, by the way, the First Amendment has been trampled on by Supreme Courts over the years, and we don't need to go into that. But it always occurred to me, as soon as I began studying this, and I guess this goes back to high school, maybe even junior high school, frankly, I never got the Second Amendment. I never got the logic of the Second Amendment. Why is it important or even helpful to democracy to have a well-armed citizenship? And it says, in the Second Amendment, for the purpose of having a well-regulated militia, the government, whatever the language is, shouldn't get in the way of citizens bearing arms. I think, unfortunately, the founding fathers, they were too close to the Revolutionary War and too close to the fact that it did take some violence and military force and weaponry and firing of bullets. After all, it was the American Revolution. It was not a peaceful revolution. It was a violent revolution. And I think that the founding fathers were so close to that they felt they had to put in the Constitution itself this fundamental right to bear arms to keep us from being a dictatorship.
Now,
And
let me get my history right here. So, the Second Amendment, is it still the 18th century when that came into the Constitution? Is this?
yes,
The year I'm
that's
thinking
correct.
is 1796. Am I right? Am I close?
Yeah, no, yes, it's the 1790s. The first 10 amendments were put forth like in 1792, 1793, and then they were ratified by the states in the year or two or three or four that follows. And so by the time we get to the year 1800, you have pretty much 10 amendments. There were a couple of amendments that looked like they were close to being ratified, then they weren't. But the Second Amendment was and is a product of the end of the 1700s, or if you want to get fancy, the end of the 18th century.
Now, the Second Amendment, in my mind, seemed to serve the country well during the War of 1812, when Washington was burned to the ground, and specifically the Battle of Baltimore, where the citizens of Baltimore, this is of course where the Star Spangled Banner, was penned, but the citizens of Baltimore raised their own militia and fought the British to a standstill, because they had pride in the country after the British had burned the Capitol down to the ground. So it seems to me that's the instance of where the Second Amendment seemed to be doing what it was supposed to do.
Well, you want to know something? I don't agree with that, and I'll tell you why.
Go ahead.
And here's why. The same thing would have happened without a Second Amendment.
Okay, yeah.
People would have, they had weapons. A lot of people had weapons back then, and the militias would have formed, and they would have done exactly the same thing. And I think here's an analogy that I think is useful for understanding this. Anyone who wants to drive can get a car, learn how to drive. You do have to pass a test to make sure that you drive safely, and you can drive. Is that a right, the right to drive a car that's in the Constitution? No. Is there an amendment, the Drive a Car Amendment? No. And millions of people drive, and you know what? The government regulates that. The government says, hey, if you're too young, like 5 years old, you can't drive. The reason why I mention that is here I am on Cape Cod, not that far from Maine or closer to Maine than I am in New York. I'll never forget, my wife and I, years ago, we were driving up in Maine, and I look at this car that drives past me. I swear to God, there was like an 8-year-old kid driving the car. I don't know what the age limit is in Maine.
Well, it was Maine, so it was an inalienable right to,
That's right. So, but look, the government regulates, by and large, driving cars pretty well. You have to get your eyesight checked. Why? I got a little humor, but it is a matter of life and death. Why do you have to get your eyesight checked? There was a report, this is about, 5 or 10 years ago, about a car is pulled over someplace in the Midwest, and there's a guy driving it, an old guy driving it, and his wife is sitting next to him. And the old guy is blind as a bat. He's totally blind. But then he's driving the car because his wife is telling him, okay, Herb, slow down. We're getting to a light now. Herb, here you make a left turn. All right, stop bothering me. I know what I'm doing. Okay. But anyway, the whole point is it's a very sensible law. It's a very sensible restriction. You have to see well enough to drive. And that's why you get an eye exam. And if you need glasses, you have to have glasses. Otherwise, you don't get a license.
Unless you have that guy's wife sitting with you.
Right, that's right. She's available for hire still, by the way. Very inexpensive. She'll come and help you out wherever you need her.
She's kind of abrasive, though, but, it's worth it.
She's a little bit of a nag sometimes, but... if all she did was basically give advice about driving, it would be okay. But she also has suggestions. Oi, put on a cleaner shirt next time. You never know who we're going to run into. The poor guy is blind. He can't tell if his shirt is clean.
You wear those shoes to those
Yeah.
Here we go.
But anyway, look, it's no laughing matter. But just to close off that point, and yet, based on the Second Amendment, there's been an interpretation, and it's always been lingering in the background, but Scalia's decision in 2008, I can't remember the name of it, I'm so disgusted with it, basically said that the Second Amendment applies not only to a well-regulated militia, but every citizen can get a gun if he or she needs to defend themselves. That is the sacred right that's enshrined in the Second Amendment. And that, built on the Second Amendment itself, that's what leads to an 18-year-old kid buying a semi-automatic weapon, which if you ask anyone else in the world, if you ask Vladimir Putin, even he would agree that is insane, totally insane. Why does an 18-year-old kid need a semi-automatic weapon? So I've now come to the position, and a lot of people vehemently disagree with me. They think it does more harm than good to say it because it angers people who want their guns. I think ultimately we need to repeal the Second Amendment once and for all. It was not a good idea or necessary in the first place. That's not going to take guns away from people any more than the fact that we don't have an amendment that guarantees everyone's right to drive a car is stopping millions and millions of people from driving.
Yeah, it's well, two things. I don't understand how we got to a place where we're so terrified that we need this level of firepower. And I understand the difference between sport hunting or target shooting, but I don't really understand this at all. And every once in a while I'll read some comment on a board or something, on a comment thread, and they'll say, well, I want to have this type of rifle because I want to take it to the range and shoot it. I want to have that experience. I'm like, okay, do you really need to own that if you want to have that experience? So there's that. But the whole thing seems to be hinging on the fact that there's a tremendous amount of money being made here. And we can talk about, should it be better regulated? Should these types of guns not be for sale? Should there be a limit to how much ammo can go through? Should bump stocks? All these different things. And whenever debate about this comes up, which it has recently, it gets shot down. So my idea, Paul, is it time to get rid of the filibuster?
Oh, yeah. Well, definitely. It's time to get rid of the filibuster for all kinds of reasons. And this is really interesting because, the gun rights people who want to hold on to their guns above all else, obviously they're very, very fond of citing the Second Amendment, which is, unfortunately, I have to say, but it is, I have to admit, it is in the Constitution. It's the Second Amendment. It's a very powerful law right now. But is the filibuster in the Constitution? No. So basically, it's just some nonsense that some, I think, anti-democratic with a small d senators put in there. I don't care what their reasons were whenever it was 50 years ago. Frankly, excuse me, where I come from, in a democracy, a majority vote wins, period. You have 100 senators, you have 51 who want something, it's law. Or you have 100 senators and it's split 50-50, and the vice president, who acts as president of the Senate, can break that tie. That's it. I don't understand Joe Manchin. I don't understand Kristen Sinema. This gets in the way over and over and over again, not only of having sensible gun control, but frankly, we could spend 5 hours talking about them, and that still wouldn't be enough. The many things that the filibuster has gotten in the way of. Why isn't there a federal law guaranteeing a woman's right to control what happens inside her own body? Why isn't there a federal law? Answer: because the filibuster gets in the way of it. And then all the various things, look, Biden is not a perfect president, but he did come up with a whole bunch of policies and suggestions for laws which would have been very helpful. We'd be in much better shape now if those laws had been passed. And a couple managed to get through, and the rest basically, because Joe Manchin didn't like it, good, he's entitled to his opinion. But, if you have, let's say, 48, 49 Democrats and you can just get one or two other Republicans, you don't need Joe Manchin anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, I think, this is, again, this inconsistency that we have in our country. You want to stand by the Constitution. You want to stand on the Constitution when whatever it is that's in the Constitution supports what you want, like total freedom to buy any weapon you want. But if there's something that's being discussed, if it's some kind of policy, it's not part of the law, it's just a custom, then, those same people have no problem saying, hey, no, that's very important. I'm not going to violate the filibuster. Look, it's not only the filibuster, it's the Electoral College. We've talked about that.
Yes.
Also, right? I mean, again, in a democracy, is it me? Am I ignorant of some profound principle? In a democracy, you have an election. Whoever gets the greatest number of votes should win. The end of discussion.
Yeah.
We know why the Electoral College was created. It's because the founding fathers, they were great in many ways, but they were afraid of democracy. And they tried to put into our laws and ways of doing things various elements that separated pure democracy from the creation of government. So that's a very, anachronistic thing as well. And frankly, not to revisit this, that's why we had probably the worst president in American history in office from 2016 to 2020. He lost the popular vote. Hillary Clinton was elected president in 2016. Beginning and end of story. The only reason that she didn't become president is because we have an electoral college. And by the way, I do have to say, here in terms of the electoral college and what we're talking about regarding guns, people around the world think that we in the United States are insane in terms of the way we approach guns in our law. And they also think we're crazy, if they are a democracy, the way we elect presidents. That's not the way it is in England or France. That's not even the way it is in Poland. And actually Poland's a pretty good country now. So, totally,
that's kind of amazing where Poland has come from, over the decades.
Right. Yeah. So look, this is a tragic situation. I'm not the first person to say this. After Sandy Hook, a lot of people are saying, okay, look, the NRA, as powerful as it was back then, it was more powerful then than here 10 years later. It's still pretty powerful now, but it was more powerful then. But a lot of people were saying, oh, but you know what? If you think about what happened at Sandy Hook to those poor kids.
And you know what, Paul? And when we talk about that, and I remember Sandy Hook, and when I was preparing to move up here, when we were working on it and getting my son up here into like a school and a group home and all that went with it, we would, to save time, to avoid traffic. Time was not saved, but to avoid traffic, we would drive that way, and we would drive through Sandy Hook, and it was difficult to go through that. And at the end of the day, I said to myself, how is it that nothing happened? And how is it that some people don't even believe it actually happened? They believe it was theater, and it's killing me. And when this thing happened in Texas, not so much the Buffalo was an act of pure racism, but Texas, it just smacked of Sandy Hook so much, and I still don't know a lot about the gunman. I know he was an adult. He was able to buy the weapons. He was allowed to. He was legally allowed to buy the weapons. He went to that school district. I don't understand why he targeted an elementary school, though. I mean, there were reports that he was bullied and that he was upset with school, but I don't understand, that. There's a lot to unpack here. But his grandmother survived, though. I'm hoping we can hear something at some point about his state of mind, because we actually have a survivor in this case, not so in Sandy Hook. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, the clearest explanation I've heard, and I don't know, obviously, whether this is true or not, but is so he wanted to kill his grandmother. He shot her in the face. Fortunately, she survived. He got in his car and he drove away. It's not clear where he was driving to. His car crashed into something, and he got out of his car and looked around and saw there was a school there.
Okay.
But it's not 100% clear to me. He might have been driving towards the school and the car crashed, or he might have been driving someplace else and the car crashed.
Okay.
And I mean, from what I've read, again, it's a comedy of errors, although it's not a comedy at all. It's a tragedy of errors.
Yes.
What happened is I think, I don't know whether it was a teacher or some school administrator, heard the car crash. She opened a back door, and I'm not sure what she saw or didn't see, but she went back into the school but left the door open because she had intended to go out again to, I guess, see what was going on with the car crash. And it was then that the murderer got into the school. Okay. So, but again...
So this is basically someone in like a highly agitated state of mind who just wants to go on a rampage. And he may not even have had the elementary school in mind. But I mean, this is all conjecture on our parts right now.
That's right. It is all conjecture. And, you know,
had he had a single action shotgun, he would have hurt people, but he wouldn't have been a mass murder. Had he had, a small handgun that didn't have the ability to reload quickly, people would have gotten hurt or killed, but maybe not have been this. I mean, you have to bring in the actual objects he was using, the actual gear he was using into the argument, though. And the fact that he was able to get these things, or that they were offered for sale at all, I think I have this number wrong, but I think I read somewhere that there were 200 million of those type of rifles in people's hands in the country. Am I right? Or have you heard that number? I may have had that wrong.
No, I actually am not sure about that. So I won't say anything one way or the other.
So take that with a grain of salt. Yeah.
Yeah, but there are plenty of them, that's for sure. By the way, I was talking to my wife about this. I was wondering how much they cost. So for an 18-year-old kid, I assume they must cost hundreds of dollars, maybe even more than that. And I do know, I did read more than once, he had two of them, two semi-automatic weapons. So, by the way, this sounds almost like a facetious, all too clever suggestion, but I'm not being facetious at all. I think one of the things the government could do right away is start, and again, I don't know whether
it's $800. An AR-15 costs $800.
Okay. So this is what I would suggest. I don't know if Biden can do this as an executive order or something that has to be passed by Congress, but let's assume that the federal government can do this. I would offer $1,000, so people make a $200 profit. We will buy your semi-automatic weapon for $1,000. So you're going to come out ahead, and we'll take that weapon and we'll ship it over to Ukraine so they can use it against the Russians.
And I can hear heads exploding when you say that. No one's going to take my guns away, And for years, people were terrified that, oh my goodness, a Democrat's president, Bill Clinton's going to take our guns away. Barack Obama's going to take our guns away. Joe Biden is going to take our guns away. Has anybody ever taken anybody's guns away?
No, frankly, I wish they would, but it would be a lot safer. Look, to be totally honest with you, you and I were talking, earlier in the hour about, our mutual love of Star Trek and the Beatles and so on. And, everybody has loves and things that they don't care about or even dislike. I'll be honest, with you and my listeners, I've never fired a gun in my life. I have no desire to. And, I'm quite happy, but if somebody enjoys hunting, okay, That's fine with me. I wouldn't get in their way. But the problem is the weapons that you're using for hunting, when they're carried to their ultimate degree, result in you can't use a semi-automatic weapon for hunting, at least as far as I know. What are you going to do? Massacre a herd of deer? But yes, as you said before, look, we're never going to live in a world without murders. Everybody has knives in their house. They're in the kitchen. We use them to cut our food. A person, a deranged person, or a person filled with hatred, and the two are pretty much the same. They can pick up a knife and kill some people. And that's happened many, many times throughout history. But the police would be able to deal with that immediately. And to get back to what we were saying before, the idea of police en masse outside the building where this is going on, or maybe in the building just down the hall from where this is going on, and not going in and confronting the murderer, that wouldn't have happened if the murderer had only a knife or even just a pistol or a rifle. So for that reason alone, I don't look, something else, I would never become a cop, Mm-hmm. If somebody said, hey, you know what, I'll quadruple your salary and you can, but we'd like you to be a police officer. I wouldn't become a cop, not because I'm a coward, but because I would get no pleasure even giving a person a ticket. Why would I get any pleasure out of that? But I understand there are people who enjoy being police. Great. We do need police because there are criminals. There are people who do crazy things. I'm not in favor of defunding the police. That's crazy. We do need police, but we need police who can do their job. And allowing anyone who's over 18 to buy this kind of weapon for $800, which again, this needs to be investigated. So this kid bought two of them. So 18 years old, this kid had access to $1,600. I don't know about you, Phil. When I was 18, I didn't have access to $1,600. I mean, I'm trying to think, how much money did I get for my bar mitzvah? But they were like in bonds, I think. So I couldn't have used
That's
them
some
anyway.
bar mitzvah you take.
Yeah, I know. So look, we shouldn't make light of this, but this kid got that money from someplace.
Yeah,
so and that as well.
And just as a side note here, if you look at I'm a big fan of Heather Cox Richardson, and if you look at her newsletter from May 24th, which happened which she wrote right after this incident happened, she goes over the history of the NRA, and she writes. I'm just going to pull out a paragraph here. She writes, by the 1920s. Rifle shooting was a popular American sport. "Quote-unquote riflemen competed in the Olympics, in colleges, and in local, state, and national tournaments organized by the NRA. Being a good marksman was a source of pride mentioned in public biographies, like being a good golfer in 1925, when the secretary of the NRA apparently took money from ammunition and arms manufacturers. The organization, check this out, tossed him out and sued him." What?
Yeah.
What? NRA officers insisted on the right of citizens to own rifles and handguns, but worked hard to distinguish between a law-abiding citizen and who should have access to guns. And of course, the article that she writes goes on to talk about what happened in the 1970s, where it became more about opposing gun control, about joining political action committees, and then the Supreme Court thing you mentioned before, I believe here it is. It says in 1997, let me know if I have this one right, when the Brady Bill cases came before the Supreme Court, and remember, it was a Republican who got shot. It was Reagan who got shot that the Brady Bill came from. Came before the Supreme Court as Prince versus the United States. The Supreme Court declared parts of the measure unconstitutional. Was that what you were referring before about Scalia?
No, that what you're saying is important too. What I'm talking about was more like 2006, 2007, 2008, and it was also a Scalia decision. It was in that decision that Scalia explicitly said that he, as a Supreme Court justice, and he convinced a majority of people on the Supreme Court then, and the majority in those days, that's yet another story, is because George W. Bush was able to appoint at least two justices at that point, Roberts and Alito. And not to get too far from that, that's because the same Scalia on the Supreme Court prevented the recount in Florida in the 2000 election.
Yes.
So, but that's why all this happened. So with a majority of justices agreeing with him, Scalia said it's time that we recognize that the Second Amendment is not something which pertains only to a well-regulated militia. The Second Amendment should be interpreted as the government will do nothing to get in the way of a citizen buying weaponry to defend himself, his home, herself. It was, it was not a male thing. It was anyone, any American. And that's basically what really opened the floodgates to this. This is yet, another, issue that we should, discuss. The Supreme Court, while we're at it, in terms of what's in the Constitution and what's not in the Constitution. I had meant to say that before, but it's also a very important point. The number of justices is not laid out in the Constitution.
That's true. Wasn't it the fact that Roosevelt threatened to pack the court, that he managed to get his New Deal through?
Yes, exactly. And when I grew up, and I remember saying that Roosevelt's wanting to pack the court was cited as a horrible thing. What's going on here? The president is not getting his way, and therefore he wants to increase the number of justices just to have a bunch of puppets support what the president wants. Well, that was a pretty good Republican argument. But what I didn't realize back then is Roosevelt had every right, it would have to be passed by Congress, of course, to increase the number of justices on the court. And, again, listen, I don't want to get too far off talking about Biden. I think he's done a lot of good things. I don't think he's the best president we ever had. I would like to see him push for that as well. And, the current Supreme Court, not only are they not reliable in terms of a sensible gun policy, but, in terms of a woman's right to choose, this decision is probably going to come down in the next week or two.
Yep.
That's something that's outrageous also.
And we're talking with Paul Levinson, who has opinions. And if you agree with those opinions, God bless you. And if you disagree with those opinions, remember that those opinions belong to Paul and myself. So if you are loving what you're hearing, well, that's awesome. High fives to you. If you're not liking what you're hearing and it's making you angry, well, that's awesome. High fives to you. But if you're upset about that and you want to write a letter, address it to me and Paul.
Yeah,
this is freeform radio, and Paul will sell you a book and a CD.
Well, let me just add something. Here's my addition to that great announcement that Captain Phil just made. If you don't like what you're hearing from Paul, too bad.
Are you familiar from 2000, what year was it? Hang on, give me 1 second. From 2012, there in the New York Review of Books, there was an article by Gary Wills called Our Moloch. And he compared the love and the ownership of firearms in America to Moloch, who was represented by Milton. And he quotes Paradise Lost, saying, "First Moloch hard king besmeared with blood of human sacrifice and parents' tears, though for the noise of drums and timbrels loud their children's cries unheard, that passed through the fire to his grim idol." And he takes this article and he compares it to what happened in Sandy Hook. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very painful to read. But are you familiar with that at all, Paul? Am I ringing any bells?
Yes, I actually read that at some point. So, yeah, I am familiar with it. I mean, let me just say, we don't need to mythologize or make reference to Milton to get on the ball and understand what needs to be done here. The value of these kinds of classical references is they sometimes help us get perspective on things. I can't think of anything that's more obvious than that there is something fundamentally wrong with our country right now. I mean, there are many things that are wrong with it, but something deeply, deeply wrong with it. In a country in which these kids could get slaughtered like that. And you don't need to read Milton. You don't need to read Gary Wills. You don't need to read the Bible. I sound like John Lennon. I don't believe in Jesus. I don't believe in the Beatles. I don't believe in them. But I mean, that, John Lennon could write a great song about this. You don't need any of that stuff. You just need a modicum of common sense and human decency to be so utterly revolted by what happened in Texas that you come to the conclusion something has to be done about this. And so I've been saying ultimately we have to repeal the Second Amendment, but that's the ultimate thing. What needs to be done now, right away, is a series of steps beginning with not allowing anyone to buy a weapon like this. Frankly, I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, there are nuclear weapons in existence. Should we interpret the Second Amendment to say, hey, I can go out and get the ingredients and make my own nuclear bomb? No. And not only that, we don't allow someone to buy, I don't even know what you would call it, the kind of thing you have on your shoulder and you can shoot down a plane with it. Right? So we already have restrictions on these things. But somehow the line was drawn at a dreadfully incorrect place. And yeah, I would be happy if the line were drawn no firearms of any kind for any American citizens. That's what I would love to see. But I would settle for, and I think any decent-minded person would have to agree with me, I would settle for none of these weapons available. The weapons that were used in Sandy Hook, the weapons that were used in Texas. And by the way, let me also add,
and then the vast majority of gun owners agree with you. There's a lot of numbers. The people who don't agree with you happen to be in Congress.
Yeah. I have to say, as you know, I'm a professor at Fordham University. And I would say, 10 to 15 years ago, time flies by, I was teaching one of my freedom of expression classes. And there was a young man in my class who was very interested in freedom of expression. And he raised his hand and he said, you keep talking about the First Amendment and freedom of expression. How come you haven't mentioned that there wouldn't be a First Amendment if there were not a Second Amendment in which people with guns could rise up in support of the freedom that the First Amendment provides? And I remember saying, well, that may be the case, that people with guns will rise up and support that. But basically what seems to be happening is people with guns are rising up and killing, shooting down innocent people. And by the way, let me say also, just again, to give a little historical context, I don't know what it is about Texas. I've been to the state a few times. I have some friends there. It's a nice enough state. I enjoyed Dallas, the television soap opera. So, I have nothing against Texas. But, the first mass shooting took place in the 1960s in Texas. A guy got on top of a school building with a rifle and just began shooting people down in the plaza of the building. And that in modern history was the first mass shooting. So it began, I think it was in 1966. And that, unfortunately, is the tragic initiation of this kind of slaughter. And ever since then, people were saying, well, what can we do to stop this from happening? And again, let's be clear, we haven't talked about this also, this aspect of it. Mental illness, yeah, there's a lot of mental illness around. People get sick, people get physically ill, people have mental problems. That's life. We're not the only country in the world with mentally ill people, but we're the only country in the world where year after year, innocent people get slaughtered, including children, by these guns fired by people who have mental illness. So it's not mental illness that's the problem. That doesn't happen in England. It doesn't happen in France. It happened once in Australia. And the Australian government, I don't know, the next day pretty much passed a law banning those weapons. That's the last time that happened in Australia. And they knew what to do. We don't.
And coming from a place where I worked, I actually work with children who needed that sort of care, and to get yourself into the system, if you have a mental illness, or if you are the parent of someone with mental illness, or the spouse, or the child of someone with mental illness, the hoops you have to jump through to get that particular person or yourself care is unbelievable. It's just so difficult. There's someone who's already agitated, and if someone, and this happens a lot too. If this is where the term defund the police, I think, got its poorly named origin. If someone is in crisis, a mentally ill crisis, and they become a danger to themselves or to the people around them, the thing you're supposed to do, Paul, is call the police.
Yeah,
and so many times the police come into that situation with guns blazing, because for police, it's like every single solution to a problem, it's like the hammer and the nail, Every single solution to a problem, that needs to be fixed for the carpenter is a hammer, and every solution is a gun. And not to say that coming into a crisis situation where someone, is about to hurt themselves or others, isn't a stressful and scary thing. More often than not, the aid that we're hoping to get these people turns into tragedy. And I remember, because working with autistic, students and multiply handicapped students, both physical and, there was a story, you could look this up, of a caregiver, someone who was taking care of an autistic, I think a young adult, and that person just got out. He got out of his control situation, and he was wandering around, and the client was white. The autistic client who, this man was taking care of was white, and the person, who was in charge of him was black. And the police were called because somebody was scared. And an autistic adult, a large autistic adult wandering the streets, doing things you're not expecting to see when someone wanders the streets is scary. You don't know what this person is going to do. If you're not familiar with, that sort of thing, you don't know what's going to happen. So the police were called, and they shot his caregiver.
Oh, gosh.
While the caregiver was lying on the ground with his hands over his head, flat on his back. They shot him when he was laying flat on his back, because somehow they felt that man was a danger while the autistic client was sitting nearby, and it's just doing what he does, and it's, you can look this up. It was just unbelievable that it went down that way, and it just seemed to be like the worst that it could come to that. So when these things happen, and if you have, and this is from my own personal experience, if you have a family member or somebody in crisis, in the back of my mind, the last thing I want to do is call the police, because I don't want them to get shot. And I don't want to get shot, Yep. So there's always that thing, and I just wish there was some support where this kid from Texas, or the kid in Sandy Hook, because truly the kid was a victim too in Sandy Hook. Yes, he was very, very disturbed. It was very, very terrible and terrifying. But I don't think he, arrived on this planet wanting to be that way. This was part of his disability, and had he gotten the care he needed, and maybe the care he needed was to be not sitting in a room in the house with his mother and all these firearms, maybe that could have been it. So you just have
but the point is, it's not the mother that was the problem; it's the firearms. So
yes.
That's why that's the point I was making. Yeah, there are a lot of people with problems. Sometimes people have the problems all their lives. That's been clear since they were kids. Sometimes these problems develop later on in life. But one thing which is clear, and this gets back again to what we've been talking about, and you can't talk about this too much because on the one hand, it's such an obvious point, and on the other hand, it seems that we as a country seem paralyzed, unable to do something about it, because this very obvious point is no one should have these weapons. It's as simple as that. And then if, God forbid, there's somebody with some serious problems and they have violent impulses and whatever else is going on, they just can't express those violent impulses. And again, you have violent impulses just like right now, May 29th, 2022, someone with violent impulses, going through some horrible, mental issues, can't go into a room and press a button and launch a rocket,
yes.
which will hit a school and blow it up.
Yes.
That can't happen, right? Because we as a society recognize the only people who can do that are people in the military who are very carefully trained and, et cetera, et cetera. So what we need to do is have similar ways of preventing people who have problems from having access to these weapons. And the only way that I know of doing that, since we can't predict when someone who's feeling fine one day has a problem another day, again, mental illness is like any other illness. I'm feeling fine yesterday. Today I wake up with COVID or a bad cold or whatever the problem is. So since you can't predict it, again, this is just basically simple common logic. Don't let anyone have access to those weapons. And that's why, to get back to what I was saying before, people around the world think that we are crazy here in the United States about this, and they're right. And to get back again to Vladimir Putin, who still is on my mind because of what's going on in Ukraine, but he must be enjoying this immensely.
Yeah.
He's now able to tell the Russian people, you want democracy? You think democracy is good? You think the Americans know what they're doing? When was the last time somebody went into a Russian school and killed 19 little kids?
Yeah.
Teachers. And the answer is it never happened there. So this is, by the way, what fascist dictatorships have always said. And in the case of the United States, and in this particular case, they're not wrong at all. But again, I'm glad you mentioned the point that I wasn't aware of that example, that the horrible example of an African-American caretaker. He's the one who gets killed by police.
He wasn't killed, but he was shot. He was shot in the leg.
Okay.
It was ridiculous.
Shot in the leg. I mean,
yeah, but it's ridiculous because he was, okay, so he was, as a former, teacher in that sort of thing, I'm looking at the situation, I was like, that's the guy who's assigned to this kid. It's his job to make sure this kid doesn't get hurt. So he's perfectly right to be wandering around, following this kid around to try to get him back under control safely. That's what he was trained for. The police show up, and now he's laying on the ground because he doesn't want to get shot, saying, "Don't shoot me. I'm here to take care of the kid," and they shoot him in the leg. With his hands are up in the air when he says it. You can see the video, and I'm looking at this like, in what world does this make any sense whatsoever?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I have a solution to that too, and you'll like this as a devotee of science fiction. RoboCop has been used as a, well, I think we're never going to get out of this until we have cops who are robots, literally, because at least they'll be programmed apropos of Asimov's 3 laws of robotics.
Yes.
And they won't let any harm befall a human being or do any harm to a human being, except to protect another human being. And they won't, make these kinds of mistakes. And again, from my own personal experience, I'm sure everyone has these experiences. I'll give you another example from the many fascinating experiences of Paul Levinson, apropos of my music. Years ago, Ed Fox and I were on a train that we got in Manhattan going out to the very end of Brooklyn where there was a recording studio.
Yes.
In fact, I'll give it a little credit, Rossi Recording Studio. And we were going out there to finish working on my first album and for many years, my only album, Twice Upon a Rhyme. Okay, so here's the story. Ed and I are on this train and over our shoulder, we hear like a guy saying something. It was like some guy was like drunk. And by the way, he wasn't African-American. He was, a white guy. And he was like talking to himself and he was like looking around, people were walking away from him. And we were approaching our stop where we had to get off at this stop in Brooklyn to go to the recording studio. And this guy is getting up and he's like beginning to say menacing things. And who walks into the car from another car because he sees people are leaving the car and we're huddled by the door, but a cop. And so Ed and I look at each other and say, good. The cop comes over and in a very short, like 15-second period of time, the train pulls into the station, the doors open, and the cop basically takes this guy bodily and pushes him out onto the station. Except it's the station that we want to go out on. And I start walking out. The cop says, no, don't go out the station. I said, look, we have an appointment. No, I'm telling you, don't go. I'll put you under arrest. And so in his brilliant mind, he thought that we were having an argument with this guy. He should have kept the guy on the train. And so we wound up coming like a half an hour late to our recording session. So if you hear one of the songs on Twice Upon a Rhyme and it sounds like I'm singing with like a little annoyance in my voice, that's why. But again, look, that's a very minor example compared to the terrible things that cops do. But the problem is, in order to be an effective cop, you really have to get an enormous amount of training and understand, what's going on and not, make judgments that are in any way, racially motivated.
Right. You have to divorce yourself from your own personal prejudices.
That's right.
You have to see people, as human beings, as all the same, and not this person is a person of color. I don't trust him. It can't be like that. It can never be like that. And this is the reason why we have so much upsetness and unrest. And of course, the choir chimes in with these sort of things. Like, well, if he wasn't speeding, he would have been killed. If he didn't have a counterfeit $20 bill, he wouldn't have been choked to death on someone's cell phone video. If he wasn't selling cigarettes on the corner, he wouldn't have been killed there. And you listen to this stuff and it's like, how do we get to a place where we don't have any compassion? All right, if he's doing something wrong, arrest him. He has rights. Read him his rights. You can't sell cigarettes. You're under arrest. You're going in. All right, you paid a fine or whatever it is. But to kill the guy, you have a counterfeit $20 bill. I've had people have handed me counterfeit money before and I didn't know, and I'd taken it to the bank. Nobody stepped on my neck.
No, I know. Well, that's exactly right. And again, if you look around the world, obviously police need weapons, but they don't carry their weapons around with them all the time. So, for example, what happened, I'm sure we talked about this as well, not many miles from where the trial of the officer who murdered George Floyd was taking place, as you may recall, a police officer, a woman, basically says she thinks she's pulling out her taser, and instead she pulls out a gun and kills this poor guy.
Yes.
And I don't even know why he was stopped in the first place.
And that person had years of experience.
Yeah, exactly right. But this is always when you try to look at, well, why did this tragedy happen? Whether it's what happened in Uvalde, or whether what happened a few miles north of wherever the George Floyd trial was taking place, or the trial of COVID was taking place. It always amounts to the same thing. This police officer who killed that poor guy in the car, she wouldn't have killed him if she wasn't carrying a gun. She shouldn't have been able to reach for something by mistake. Yeah. All she should have had is the taser. That should be more than enough. And people in England understand that. People in France understand that. And, we here in the United States, we put ourselves up always as, hey, we're the world's most advanced democracy and we know what's right and blah, blah, blah. And in fact, we don't. We're in the Middle Ages when it comes to what law enforcement should be doing. So, and then this is why what happened to those poor kids in Texas is such it's a lesson. It's such an horrendous lesson, but it's a lesson that we can't afford to ignore, because now we know that not only do cops shoot all too quickly, not only do police shoot an African-American kid in a playground because they think he's carrying a gun. Not only do they shoot and kill people, shooting them in the back as they're running away. Mm-hmm. We don't have to go over all these stories. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of stories. Not only do the police of America do that, but when there's a time when they should be going in there shooting, we have to wait. He's just barricaded now. So, come on. I mean, what more do you need? They can't do anything right, I'm sorry to say. They're trigger happy when they...
And looking at whatever's going down there, and this is very close to the southern border as well. It's really, just watching that press conference I watched the other day, oh my goodness. It was like, can we make this any worse? Yes. Let's call a press conference and make it worse. That was just so confusing. And at the same time, they're going to hold the NRA meeting, a couple of days later. And they went ahead and did it. Of course, Abbott did it by video. He didn't have the courage to come in and stand there. Trump showed up. There wasn't any guns in the place then. They made sure of that. Yeah. And the musicians that played, it's just beyond belief. It's just beyond belief. It's just incredible that meeting wasn't canceled.
No, I know. So, quote Martin Luther King, I have a dream, and we'll see whether it comes true or not. I have a dream that Beto O'Rourke, who, as I'm sure you saw, stood up and challenged that Abbott, and his toadies basically. That's another one of these things that infuriates me. Now's not the time to talk about this. Well, when the hell is the time to talk about this? Are you kidding me? Now is eminently the time to talk about this. It should have been talked about, and there should have been action taken, i.e. get these dangerous weapons out of the hands of everyone a long, long time ago. So all those toadies on stage, all of his advisors could do is tell Beto O'Rourke, now's not the time to talk about this.
And they're yelling at him, they're calling him an SOB, and they're screaming at him and stuff like this. Right. It's like, this doesn't really sound like and you know something, Paul, I remember seeing this years ago. I don't know if it was, I think it was not John Kennedy, it was the brother that also got assassinated.
Robert F. Kennedy. It was RFK.
Yeah, he was delivering a speech. He was on the campaign trail. He was delivering a speech, and there was a protester there. And this particular Kennedy brought him up on the dais with him, and had a debate with him about what was going on. I believe, what was it? Was it a Bush thing where a protester came and was yelling, and they tasered him, and that was the "Don't tase me, bro" line that came out.
Yes.
How much would it have gone to rehabilitate a little bit of this argument if Abbott had just brought Beto up on stage and sat down across from him, and they two men had an adult conversation about this. I think we could have really, really moved ahead there, and of course, because Beto is who he is, he's not allowed in the room. He's not allowed to comment on this, and that's the whole thing, that the dissenting voice always has to be suffocated out in this situation. But, in my heart of hearts, I saw that incident that happened, with the Kennedys. I forget which one it was. It definitely was not the first President Kennedy,
no, it was Robert F. Kennedy. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
And I looked at that, and even though the debate and the arguments and the issue are old and in the past, the fact that these two people could have a conversation and just a meeting of the minds, it just filled me with hope. The actual act of it, why couldn't this have happened with Beto? I think, and of course, I think Beto was awesome for doing what he did. I think it's great. And his dissenters did exactly what they were supposed to do. They did all they could do. They called them names. It turned into like a middle school, middle school argument. And that's the level that we're at. So
and that's right. But I think, my dream is, wouldn't it be wonderful if, because of that instant that we're talking about, where Beto's trying to challenge Abbott, have a debate with him about the laws in Texas, wouldn't it be wonderful if the people in Texas this coming November elect Beto governor? Would I like to see that? I think I'm going to contribute money to that Beto campaign. I think it would be a wonderful, refreshing, all too rare lesson in we're still a democracy. And, that's yet to happen. And I don't know what it's going to take to happen. And I think you can rest assured that what will happen on the federal level is not much. Maybe, that we don't know. It's possible. I heard somewhere that Senator Cornyn, who's the better of the two Texas senators, only between Ted Cruz, is like one of the worst senators in history in terms of his positions and just outright lying.
School should only have one door.
Yeah, Cornyn is a little better. And he is now, apparently, I read this in several places, in discussions with Schumer about how the Republicans and Democrats might be able to agree on some kind of legislation. And I hope that happens. I'm not going to hold my breath.
Paul.
I know.
I have two words. I have two words for you. Manchin,
Yeah, I know. But Manchin is irrelevant if we can get some Republicans. Because again...
But will we? Maybe we'll get two Republicans. Maybe we'll get Cheney,
well, she's not in the Senate, so she can't do much good. But the reason I'm saying this, that is far less likely to happen than Beto winning the governorship in the election that's going to take place this November in Texas. And, for God's sakes, this happened in their own state. How can any parent, how can any human being, how can anyone with a heart, after seeing and hearing what happened at that school, how can they possibly vote to re-elect someone who enabled that to happen? And that's what Abbott did. And not only that, couldn't even tell the public the truth.
Yeah.
In the days that happened, it comes out with complete nonsense.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about the fact there's some kind of school security guard. The first report, he engaged the shooter. No, he didn't. It turned out he wasn't even there. So what happened to him? What happened? The guy was on vacation?
Yeah.
No, this is like another genius. He passed right by the shooter. He thought some teacher on the other side of the school was the shooter. Fortunately, that guy wasn't killed. This is how the police and security people work in Texas. I'm sure not all of them, but too many of them.
An active situation, when something like this happens, there is so much that can go wrong from so many different directions. It reminds me of the Gabby Gifford shooting, where there was a good guy with a gun there, and I don't remember if he actually shot the person who had shot Gabby in the head, but I do remember that this person who was there in Arizona with a gun was targeted by law enforcement when they arrived at the scene because they didn't know. And it could have gone horribly wrong. Here's a good guy. Here's the actual person. Here is the person we were always talking about. You can't have gun control because we have to make sure the good guy with a gun will be always available. Will always be armed. Well, here he was, and he was almost taken out by law enforcement because they couldn't tell the difference. He's not standing there holding up a sign saying, "I'm the good guy with the gun," and the big guy's not standing there saying, "I'm the guy who's going to shoot, Gabby Gifford." It doesn't work like that. It's complete anarchy when this stuff happens. You don't know who is the bad guy, and mistakes happen. And I think the thrust of the whole thing we've been talking about for the last 70, 80 minutes is that these rapid fire machines of death just need not to be sold. They need to just be provided to the Army. You can't be 18 years old in Texas and buy one for $800. That shouldn't happen.
Yeah, and also let's be clear about it. They're talking about, okay, all right, so now, here's what we'll do. Maybe we'll make the age 21, not 18. You know what? Make the age 121. Yeah. Then I'll be satisfied, okay? I mean, you're going to raise the age from 18 to 21? Great. As if a 22-year-old or a 21-year-old can't do this kind of thing. And in fact, some of these mass murderers have been that old. Mm-hmm. So no one should be able to buy that gun. No one. Look, you and I have talked a lot about popular culture and this whole good guy with a gun. It's based on misequating what we see in television fiction with reality. So, Matt Dillon is the name of an actor now, but prior to that, Matt Dillon was the name of the Marshall Dillon, right, in Gunsmoke. He was a good guy with a gun. He knew what to do. There's no doubt that if Marshal Matt Dillon were there, he would have gone in single-handedly with his old 6-gun and done whatever he could to engage that active insane shooter. So again, as I was saying very early on in our discussion, this would have given some of these kids a chance to escape. But that's a myth. That's not reality. That's television. In fiction, and this is what the problem is with the NRA, they're selling a fiction to the American people.
A romanticized fiction.
Exactly right. And yeah, everyone, there are good guys with a gun. It's not completely crazy. You're right. I think the guy who stopped more people from being killed in the shooting that happened in Arizona, and almost killed Gabby Gifford, and she has recovered to a great extent. Was a good guy with a gun, but even he was not Matt Dillon. And as you correctly pointed out, the other, quote, good guys with guns who arrived didn't know that he was a good guy with a gun, because it's not a television show. It's reality. And in reality, you can't make distinctions like this.
I mean, and you can look at, we need to wrap it up soon. But
Sure.
But I think we can made it to the war in Ukraine, where you start to hear the stories of the people coming out of these places where people were pinned down, in these factories or in these tunnels for weeks, or they're being shot at. They're trying to, it's supposed to be a time where the civilians were going to get out, and now those civilians are being targeted. Those civilians are being, aimed at. And you listen, through the translator at their stories, and you realize, it's not a Spielberg movie. It's not. It's not John Wayne,
That's right.
It's not in Sense-Around. This is complete hell on earth. It's anarchy. These poor people, these grandmothers, these poor old ladies, you see this is going on. These things are happening in in a fraction of a second. And that's what's happening, what happened in Buffalo and what happened in Texas. And to be able to sit back in your armchair and say, well, if this one had this, if there was only one door, if the teachers were armed, if this, if that, if the other thing, you don't know. You can't. That's ridiculous, because these things are happening on such a fast-paced level that you can't really disassemble it. You can't act on it. You react to it. It's not something where you sit there and say, all right, here comes the big guy with the gun. I will prepare. I will lock all the doors. It doesn't happen like this. The guy's in and he's shooting at you, and you're in the hallway. Boom, boom, boom. It's happening right now. Do you go left? Do you go right? Left is death. Right is life. You don't know. It happens in that quick a second. And yeah, the fact that we try to manage this and excuse it and talk about it and try to make excuses. There's got to be a better way. And it's time to look at Australia. It's time to look at the other countries and find out why it doesn't happen there and implement those solutions.
Exactly.
And if they don't work, try different solutions. But that's right now we're in this place where we're just in stasis. You can't go forward, you can't go backwards. It's thoughts and prayers. It's too soon. Don't get political. Now it's over. And 3 weeks later, it happens again in some other poor school with some other poor people. And then the whole thing just repeats over and over again. People are tired.
And look, and I don't mean to come out against prayers and religion, but basically the prayers have not done much good, have they? There've been prayers.
I'll come out against prayer.
Yeah, so, all right.
I'll tell you why. Because I was driving back from the flea market today, and of course, on the back of my truck are my Biden stickers. My terrifying Biden stickers, the most terrifying sticker in the world, because I was too lazy to take it off after the election. And a Trump and a MAGA drives by me, and it says in giant letters on the back of their van, Donald Trump and Jesus something, and there's Jesus and Trump, and they're passing me at 75 miles an hour. By the way, Paul, 75 miles an hour. I don't think that woman was helping them drive. They have the sunroof open, Paul, and they're making gestures at me. They weren't flipping me the bird, but they definitely weren't they weren't signing "I love you," Biden supporter. They definitely weren't doing that. And I was like, how can somebody, have God in their heart and just treat me because I voted for the guy you don't like, treat me like garbage, trying to incite me to come chasing them. Oh, and by the way, Paul, a state trooper did pass me, literally 3 minutes. He came up behind me.
All right, good. So see that.
I moved over, and I was and then I was praying. I was praying that he would stop him, but he didn't stop him. Oh, see, some prayers don't get answered.
Just like a strictly selfish point of view, in a way, I'm sorry that you didn't speed, and then they would have arrested you, and then we could have been doing this interview. And here I am, Captain Phil.
Yes.
I'm in jail, but I'm doing this 2-hour show with Paul Levinson. We would have gotten a lot more. It would have been much easier to promote that to a huge audience.
Unfortunately, WUSB doesn't have any money to bail me out.
Oh, well, that's good though, because again, you could have done a series of shows. But I can't let this pass though, because my ears heard this. I am stunned. I'm happy, but I'm stunned that you had a Biden sticker on the back of your car, because I thought you were a Bernie guy. What happened?
What happened was that Bernie lost the nomination, and I was very disappointed. My kid up in the North Country does have the Bernie stuff, and I truly would have supported Bernie 100%, and I wanted to, but no, it didn't happen for him. I was kind of like Warren as well, but it's okay. And I remember when the election was happening, I remember I had you on and we were talking about Biden, and you kind of talked me off the ledge. I was disappointed with Biden, but you were like, no, I think, and you know what? You're right. He's not a perfect president. There are things I wish Biden could accomplish. And at the same time, though, I see a man who's filled with compassion. I see a man who's overcome tremendous personal disabilities that people are very happy to make fun of because of the stuttering and things like that.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what that man overcame? I've worked with stuttering kids. It is difficult. It's just astonishing, and my hat's is off to him. And anybody who thinks it's like a big joke to call him Sleepy Joe or oh look, he messed up again. You listen to him, and he has all these little verbal things that help him get through a speech, so he doesn't stand there and stutter. And it's a debilitating thing, and he overcame it. Isn't that a great story? Why do we have to go after these people all the time? It just really it burns me a little. Burns me, but burn BURN, not BERN.
Well, listen, I'm not joking. It's not a joke, But no, I agree with you 100%. The reason why people go after him, first of all, it's not just people; it's Republicans.
Yes,
it's because
that's right. I stand corrected. Absolutely.
And increasingly, Republicans are not people. I don't know what to get back to Star Trek. I don't know what new series has to get into this, but I'm convinced that they are not human. I don't know what kind of species they are.
The Romulans.
Here. Yeah, maybe. No, don't insult them. The Romulans are far more intelligent.
That's true. They're Gorn. They're the Gorns.
They're Gorn. Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. The Gorn, by the way, were in the 4th episode.
Yeah, I heard. I haven't seen it.
You'll love it. I won't say a word about that. All right, well, good. So I'm glad that I turned you around regarding Biden. No, because look, I think, again, right, first of all, nobody is perfect. And I think, by the way, I'll say this, a lot of Biden's so-called slips of the tongue are actually very good because they help move the ball forward in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember back when he was vice president, Biden, and one of the things Obama wasn't the greatest on is, gay rights. And basically, Biden in some speech said, I think, the
gay the same thing with Taiwan. And when people
exactly
are
right.
I'm like, he did the same thing with Taiwan. I was like, yes. You know what?
Exactly.
When Russia's invading Ukraine and we're going to, now is the time to stand up. And
that's right.
And let me tell you something. We're going to wrap up in the next 2 minutes. But now is the time to stand up because, watching Russia go into Ukraine, they're not looking so good. They're not the big scary bear I was always taught. The fact they'd be taken out by drones, that a nation with no navy sunk their flagship.
I love it. I love it.
I was like, oh my goodness, But there are other. We didn't have time to talk about this. There are other issues with Ukraine. I want to approach at some point down the road. But Paul, final words.
Final words are: listen, I'm sorry that we had to spend 2 hours talking about this, but I'm glad that we did, and I hope everyone keeps talking about this and talk about it until finally a majority of Americans who are in a position to vote, there is a major election coming up this November, act on these words and act on these thoughts, and maybe finally we'll get some common sense into our gun laws and begin the long, arduous process of bringing America back to reality and back into what most of the rest of the human population on this planet has long since recognized.
Paul Levinson, professor, writer, musician, political commentator, but most important, Paul, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending your precious Cape Cod time with Captain Phil. And I'm glad we had a chance to talk about this. You may not agree with everything we say. Some things may have made you angry. We're angry too. We don't like to see children killed. We don't like to see anybody killed. And so, let's see if we can move forward. And let's try to do this in a way where we can reach out together and come to a place where we don't need to be afraid of each other and move forward, as Paul says. Let's hear that website one last time, Paul.
Well, I'll give you my Twitter account, which is still the easiest way to contact me, at Paul Lev, Paulev. You may or may not like Twitter, but trust me, you'll like my Twitter feed. All kinds of good things.
Musk hasn't kicked him off yet.
That's right. So far, so good.
Fingers crossed, Paul.
I could use the publicity. Elon, kick me off, please.
Yes. He sold 10,000 copies of the Beatles alternate history book. Yes. Wait, Elon Musk bought the Beatles catalog. Oh, no. Musk. All right. I must get off this topic.
All right. Adios.
Take care, my friend. Always a pleasure. Be well.
Bye-bye.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
And I hope you enjoyed that lengthy conversation about gun control. I'm sure we offended a lot of people, to which I say, good. Better people get offended than they get killed. And if people who own guns are offended by what Phil and I were saying, well, maybe you should think about why we are so offended. And really, who cares that we're offended? But what you should care about is this horrible loss of life that just continues and continues. Something has to be done about that once and for all. In any case, I'll be back here soon with my more usual episodes of Light On, Light Through. Let's see, I think I owe you a review of The Man Who Fell to Earth. I'll, of course, be reviewing the new episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds and the new episode coming up of The Time Traveler's Wife. And in addition to that, apropos Star Trek, The Orville is coming back. In fact, I think it's up on Hulu today, June 2nd. So I'll certainly be watching and reviewing every episode of that. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sound. Continue doing whatever you can to help the brave Ukrainians get those depraved Russians out of Ukraine. You know, the Russians are killing a lot of children in Ukraine, too. They bomb indiscriminately, they pulverize buildings and cities, and the world needs to do whatever it can to get those monsters out of Ukraine.
Athens, 2042 AD. She ripped the paper in half, then ripped the halves, then ripped what was left again into bits and pieces of history that could have been. Sierra Waters had read once that, years ago, it was thought that men made love for the thrill, while women made love for the sense of connection it gave them.
Curled Up with a Good Book says, Sierra Waters is sexy as hell. You can find out more about The Plot to Save Socrates by Paul Levinson at theplottosavesocrates.com.
Paul Levinson Silk Code about an ancient biotech war raging on in secret for centuries.